Everyone, my name is Leslie Woods. I'm introducing today's session. We've got Felicity, Meakins, Turpin, and Gudgel researcher William Santo giving today's talk, and they will be discussing roles and attributions in research outputs. They'll discuss authorship and explicit recognition of multiple roles in research, which means all contributions and publications are equally valued. They will also discuss copyright and intellectual property statements that ensure future uses of knowledge are undertaken appropriately. They will also touch on models of research supervision and creative work, exegesis and PhD. Felicity and Miff will also give the acknowledgement of country from their respective places, and maybe William will as well. So over to you, Felicity, Miff and William.
Hi everyone, I'm Felicity Meakins. I'm coming to you from Yagara and Turrbal country, which is now known as Brisbane. And I'd like to acknowledge all of those people who've upheld the language of this country, and also all of the Indigenous members in this audience. Over to you, Miff.
Hi, I'm Miffy Turpin, and I'm speaking from Aranda country in Alice Springs, so I acknowledge the custodians, the Mbarnta people of this land, for their ongoing keeping of this lovely land that I'm fortunate to be on, as is William. William, would you like to say anything, shall we?
Okay, so maybe we'll get started then. So as Leslie introduced, we're going to be talking about roles and attributions in research outputs today. So we're going to do this in a fairly informal way, and just give you examples of the sorts of work that we've been involved in or that we're aware of, that might other people might find quite useful with the sorts of work that they're doing. So I should say from the outset that we're coming from the perspective, well, Miff and I are, obviously not William, but as non-Indigenous linguists in the academy, collaborating with non-academic Indigenous language experts. Of course, we've also co-authored with Indigenous academics, Clint Bracknell, Brenda Croft, and so on. But our discussion's going to relate to those former relationships that I'm talking about, so the non-academic Indigenous language experts, because they're the ones that aren't dealt with quite as well within academia with the models that we currently have. So I'm not going to talk so much, obviously, about authoring relationships with other Indigenous academics. So I've just beamed up a picture of a front cover of a book that we've published with Gurindji people. So this is in the Northern Territory. And in this particular example, you can see this is a book that's basically, it's written in Gurindji, it's translated into Gurindji, it's got QR codes in there so that you can hear the authors' voices. So in these kinds of books that we've produced, you can see that the authorship goes as the Gurindji authors first, and then the non-Indigenous linguist coming second in this particular kind of example. And you might also notice that we've done something here that isn't often done, which is that we actually also acknowledge the photographers. So particularly Brenda Croft, who's a Gurindji artist and curator. Just another example of this sort of thing. So this is a Mutbura book that we've made. And again, you can see not sure how well you can see it, but the authorship down the bottom, which again goes Mutpura authors first, and then the linguists who are involved with the transcription and translation work coming a little bit later. But there's different kinds of books that get produced by linguists. Some of us end up doing all sorts of work. So this is an example of a book where I'd have to say as a linguist, I became an accidental historian, and it's a collection of stories from Gurindji country. And one of the things that's a little bit different about this is that usually with edited works, just the editors get mentioned on the front cover, and we thought that was inappropriate, and the Gurindji community, of course, thought that that was inappropriate. So you can see that all of the contributors to the key storytellers are actually also on the front cover. They're acknowledged quite prominently, and in particular, the Malaga, the old fellow that you can see here, his name I won't call because he's passed away in the last year. He's one of the key storytellers. Jangala is also very prominent on the cover in a picture. But also on the inside of that, you get a bit more information. So again, you've got who gave the historic accounts as artworks in the book. So all of those people are acknowledged, the Gurindji artists, photography again, all of the information about the historical site guidance. So this is Gurindji elders, but also the Gurindji rangers who are really heavily involved in this project. And then the transcription, translation, and also an acknowledgement of the historical research. So on that page, you really get a good sense of who the full team was for that. And you can see there's a bit of information there about the traditional names and how to interpret skin names. So that's an example of an edited book. Looking at dictionaries, this is also something that the communities that I've worked with, there's different kinds of ways that dictionaries are done, and Miff will talk a little bit about some of the work she's done with the Kadage Dictionary. These are examples of 2 dictionaries that I've been involved with, and again, all of the key language people are named on the front cover there. The reason that I've included the Mutpura dictionary was that although that cover had quite a bit of consultation done, some feedback that's come back that is something that we need to pay heed of in the future, or if there's a second edition, is that there were a couple of members in the community who thought quite reasonably that the linguist shouldn't have been at the top of that pile, but should have come further under there. So when you're thinking about both authorship, but naming particular people's roles and responsibilities on projects, spatial awareness within that's actually really important too. And knowing, you know, where people should go and how appropriate that is something that should be done in consultation with communities. Some other examples that I want to show you. So musicology's been doing this style of authorship and attribution for quite a while, and this is something that we've borrowed from recently. So music, it's common practice to have titles like X song as sung by, and you can see an example here from a book that Miff and I have edited of Gurindji Wajara. And what's very nice about this, and this is a style that I've learned from Miff because I don't come from musicology myself, is that it makes prominent the intellectual contribution of the song men and women, but it separates the analysis of music from the creators of the music. So people have, it separates the different roles that have gone into making the book. But what's very nice about it too is that in this particular model, the song men and women end up in the citation through the title of the book. So when you're referencing songs from the stations, all of those senior song men and women from Kalkarindji, Gurindji people are very prominent in the reference and the citation. So this hasn't been the practice for grammar writing, but recently we had the Gurindji grammar come out. And one of the arguments that I had with Mouton was that actually there had not been a Gurindji book published previously where the senior Gurindji knowledge holders weren't named on the front cover. And so this was something that we insisted on for this. Mouton worked out how to make it work, and it's now precedent Mouton grammars, which I know, for instance, Tom Enever has Linguistic grammar that's coming out shortly. And because that precedent's there, he's able to now do that. So it would be really nice, I think, to use this model from music again for other kind of more traditional linguistic outputs such as grammars, so that again all of the people from the Gurindji grammar end up as part of a citation for a book within the title. And the other thing also about this is that it also again separates the Gurindji senior knowledge custodians of language from the actual analysis of the language, which of course is something that the linguists have done. And if there are Gurindji linguists in the future, they may well disagree with some of the analyses that Patrick McConville and I have made of the language. So it just sort of separates those kinds of roles. Something that I thought might be interesting to point to, so this is an example of a conversation article which has been co-authored by Clint Bracknell, Brenda Croft, Miff and myself. This fortunately was relatively unproblematic because the two Indigenous co-authors of the paper, Clint and Brenda, are both academics at universities. Previously, it wasn't the case that Indigenous collaborators who were non-academics could actually be named in conversation articles. And one nice policy change that's been made in the last year is that you can now write conversation articles with Indigenous collaborators who aren't in the university system. And I think that's a really nice push that they've made, which means that, again, we're really acknowledging where information comes from and who's important for these sorts of analyses. So a last model of authorship before I hand over to Miff is something that comes from science. So before we saw music and some of the sort of styles of authorship that music does, science has got a different model, which is that really everybody who's made an intellectual contribution to a book or a paper gets named as authors. And of course, we know with science papers, you often have a gazillion co-authors. And usually what happens with this, of course, is the head of the lab then goes as the final author on the paper. So I've just got an example here of a book that was produced with Glenn Whiteman. He's prolific, has been working with Indigenous groups all over Northern Australia. I think he's sort of up to about 45 of these books now. And this is a really classic style that he has, where all of the senior knowledge custodians, in this case, these are Jingali people and Mutpura people, are all named. The linguists are at the end, and Glenn Whiteman, as the scientist, is named as the last author there. So I think this is a really interesting model and something that maybe we should be doing a little bit more in linguistics. Certainly in papers that I've been writing, there's an example of one here where we've been doing quite a lot of quantitative work with the Gurindji community. In this particular work, Cassandra Algie, who's a Gurindji co-researcher at Kalkarindji, has been absolutely instrumental in recruiting, recording, and generally running these projects. And so without her co-led design in these projects, there wouldn't be, these papers wouldn't exist. So Cassandra hasn't wanted to be involved directly in the writing of papers, and this is certainly the case with scientific papers where you have people taking different roles, but everybody's named as authors. Whereas I think in linguistics, we've always had the sort of old tradition of just naming authors who are actual co-writers. So I think this is a shift that's going on that quite a few people are doing, at least with linguistics in Australia, which I think has been a really good way of making sure that Indigenous collaborators and people who we co-design projects with and that sort of thing are absolutely given prominent acknowledgement for the work that they contribute. So now I'm going to hand over to Miff. I shall keep driving the PowerPoint, but we shall be in step.
Yeah, hi. I'll just say a little bit more on authorship, I don't have a lot, any really different things to say, but I will come back to some of these publications when I talk about copyright. And if William comes back online again, we'll shoot over to supervision, but I just can't see the screen exactly to know if he's managed to get back online. So just to return to a point that Felicity made before about the different types of publications. So in the form of a dictionary, where there's a role of language speakers who are contributing information, often through recordings, providing information on tape. And some of these can be very big. So in the case of the Kadich Dictionary, we had some 60 people providing example sentences and meanings of words and alternative pronunciations, all sorts of information about language. And the myself and other linguists, and also some community research, that in this case in Kadich, I was fortunate to work with someone who was very, very literate in her first language, and she independently wrote a lot of examples. So in that case, we did have a co-authorship of Turpin and Ross to acknowledge the very different role that this Kadich person did in the creation of the dictionary compared to the 60 other people that of course are cited as contributors. So we decided to do that. Of course, there's not always situations like that, and I'm sure many of you have had experience in this with this. Certain people whose role has been different that stand out, but there's not always situations like that in the creation of large works like dictionaries. In the case of the Learner's Guide, there was lots of people who contributed, but no one who sort of worked on the text in the same way that I did. So in that publication, I called myself a compiler, and the many people whose sentences, etc., are listed in there. Thanks, Felicity. Okay, well, perhaps before we go on to copyright and IP, so it's sort of hard to. William, I'm not sure if you're still there, if you've managed to get back online, but just when you, if you are, unmute and sing out. But perhaps I'll go on with copyright then, and return to this discussion about supervision after going on with copyright and IP. So a lot of thought, it occupies a lot of, in publications, how we refer to various people's rights in not just the things we produce, but the sort of knowledge that's being represented in the things we produce. So I wanted to talk about some different ways that we've done this in a number of different publications that I've worked on. With things like the ethnobiology poster, in this case, edible insect larvae poster. This is not, a story or a song by any particular individual. It's community held knowledge. So Felicity, if you don't mind going on to the next one. So what we tried to do, and this is, building on many people's work, we've looked through a lot of publications and see how people are doing this. So, many of you will be familiar with these sorts of things that have possibly expanded this a lot further than what we've done recently. So we tried to cover ownership by the Kadich people, where they're spoken in the territory, and why the resource was produced. So in this case, the poster was published for the purposes of knowledge preservation, education, etc. And how it was made. So it was developed following cultural protocols of prior informed consent, attribution to traditional Aboriginal communities, cultural integrity, and sharing of benefits. So we're just sort of demonstrating how this thing was made. It wasn't just one person that did all this things with no interaction with the community. So we thought this was things that people looking at this poster might want to know about. And further uses, what if someone wants to use this poster? So then we said the information on this poster should not be used commercially. Sometimes it's easier to say what we don't want you to do with it, given that we've already said that it's made for the purposes of knowledge preservation. So it shouldn't be used commercially, including all these sorts of ways. We thought about how might someone wish to use an edible insect larvae poster. Tourism, food technology, trademarks, patents, designs, possibly some others could have been added there. And then we thought, well, we should provide a contact detail, because if someone wants to do some further uses, then they need to know who to contact to get permission. So we've put my name as the sort of coordinator, and also the Central Land Council who are aware of the project and actually are disseminating the poster. And then we've also put the consequences, the threat. So we've said that it may also breach, if you'd use these things without getting authorization, that it might breach copyright, moral rights under the Copyright Act. So we've just thought these points, which are on the next slide, can sort of help guide a statement that may assist potential users. Sorry, it's the next slide after that. Felicity, no, okay, I'll go back to it after. I'll follow up, sorry, previous slide, yeah. The next slide. So in a different case, a women's ceremonial song poster, this had a little bit more specific ownership because there are particular estates, landholding groups that own the designs that these songs refer to. So we've actually labelled these on each of the designs, so the place and the main dreaming of that place. And in the, I'll just call it the copyright and IP statement, we've got something similar to what I showed you in the previous Grub poster, but we have changed some of the potential uses and the contact details are a bit different. So we've included IATSIS here, who are actually were the funders of the original fieldwork and are where the information is deposited there. Again, I've included my email so that people have a couple of ways to get it. I think this is actually an older version of the poster there, but I think we've included the contact for IATSIS as well in the final version. And also where the poster can be got. So a slightly different situation is work that I've done recently on songs that are not owned by a single land owning group or a single language group. And so in this instance, ownership's really quite complex, I suppose. So we've decided to put this on the end of a video, which is available on ICTV. So it's a video of Judy Mackenzie talking about a traditional song that she knew. She actually filmed it in the 80s, and we've used a bit of the archival footage of that performance in the ICTV edited film that is available on ICTV, which has come from the media organisation. So we've said that in terms of ownership, that it's the cultural heritage of many Aboriginal people, including Anangu and other Aboriginal people of these states. So I said including because we don't know the extent, right? So we can only say who we've spoken to, but we know it's not comprehensive. And in this version, we didn't actually include the why it was made. So we haven't, that's something we probably should have added, but we didn't do it when we did this film and put it on ICTV. Further uses, we've sort of hinted at that with the should not be reproduced, published, and without observing the protocols of attribution and thanks. And we also didn't include who to contact, but hopefully that information is available on the, when you're on ICTV, you see who's uploaded it. But in retrospect, that's something we really should have possibly added, who to contact if you would like to get access to this. Although, of course, they can always contact ICTV. We didn't add the sort of the consequences, which we probably should have. So I'll just talk about what we did on an academic article as well. Hasn't come out, and I'd be interested to know if other people do this. But I just felt very much with song, it's really important to remind people about the ownership that Indigenous people have over their music. So this is an academic article, but with much toing and froing, touch wood, it will come out. I've argued for this in the journal. So again, a statement about ownership that's cultural heritage of many people, and how it was made. The consent. We thought it was very important to make a statement about how consent was obtained and the way that was done, and including putting the ethical clearance numbers as well as the permits for the research, which are in there as well. So that's sort of relating to the how it was done, and again, something about the further uses, that it should not be reproduced without consent, and obviously who to contact, sort of clear with it in an academic article where you've got email addresses and points of contact for someone. So just to, I guess, summarize, and there's probably other things that could be added, and I'd like to hear about how what copyright statements could include. So ownership rights, the way we made this thing, how we did it, how we don't want it to be used, and if you do want to use this thing, who to contact, and some consequences of breaching law. So I've ran a few of these statements by the lawyer Judy Robb, who worked with Terry Janke on this recent publication, The More Than Words, about copyright in Indigenous Australia, and she thought it was all fine. She does pro bono work on the for Sydney. She coordinates the pro bono work in a Sydney ICIP company, Banky Haddock Fiora, and so it was sort of reassuring to know that this is not this is in line with the sorts of things that lawyers in the ICIP sector are already talking about. I think that's it on for me. I know you want to go on to that, Felicity, and then we'll just go back to supervision.
Yeah, sure. So I probably I think the way that MIF's doing sort of copyright and IP statements is quite comprehensive. In the book industry, there's kinds of standards. So I've got an example up here where we've got, this is a book that came out with Aboriginal Studies Press. So there was sort of less arguing on the basis of this, but so that this is where these particular stories aren't copyrighted to the individual storytellers, and certainly not to Erica Troller and I as editors, but because they're historical stories, they're not dreaming stories, they don't have sacred and secret content. The decision by the community through the Arts Centre was to copyright the book to Gurindji people. It turns out that actually really you're supposed to copyright to organisations, not to people, but this was not advice that we had at the time that we were doing this. So another example here, is from the recent grammar that's come out. So again, this took a bit of arguing with Mouton, but what we've done with this is the way that Mouton de Gruyter works is that the publisher themselves actually take copyright over the book. Other publishers give copyright to the authors. So it's a little bit different in the academic publishing industry. But what we insisted on was that although the publisher had copyright over this sort of physical shape of the book, that all of the Gurindji language examples and sound files, this is a grammar where each of the example sentences is linked to a sound file so you can actually hear people speaking. So all of this is then copyrighted to Karankanni Art and Culture Aboriginal Corporation, which is the organisation that takes, it's an Aboriginal corporation that takes the legal and moral representation, I guess, for Gurindji language, culture, song, this sort of thing. So that's what we did in that particular instance. One of the other things that we did that was a little bit different, so when, which will be relevant to this next lot of agreements that I show you, is that for this particular book, at this time, the art industry had actually really galvanised, and art reproduction costs were something that had come in as that was being done through the Art Centre. So this was a project that was being done through both the Ranger Group but also Karankanni Arts. So there's a number of artists who are represented in this book, and those artists were paid for the reproduction of their artwork. And so we sort of went along with this, but it got me thinking that one of the things that we don't have an industry standard for actually is paying for story reproduction costs. So one of the things that we've brought in through the Art Centre with the grammar is that the main contributors of the grammar, who also have one substantial text that's glossed in the back, were actually given a story reproduction fee. So this is something that's being brought in through this Art Centre as a standard. So for instance, at the moment we have a termite project that's producing a children's book, and it's very much a combination of art and language, and it seems quite unfair to be privileging the artists over the storytellers. So as well as the usual things that are that people are being paid to tell the stories, artists are able, of course, to sell their paintings, but the other thing we're doing is paying reproduction costs for both the artwork and the language that's being used in the book, which seems to be a slightly fairer way of thinking about language, but hasn't sort of, there's no industry standard for this. So what I wanted to show you was a couple of examples of the kinds of agreements that were put together. So this first agreement, so the reason I'm showing this particular one is this is one that's been has gone through an arts lawyer, so a non-Indigenous arts lawyer, but somebody who's in the industry who has looked over it. One of the things that was really important for us was that it was in plain English, not in legalese, and she thought that that was absolutely fine. So the first part of this is the background with the agreement about what we're doing and how we're going about it. So we're making a book about termites, and it's bringing together Western scientific knowledge and Gurindji knowledge, but we're using the terms Ngumman for Gurindji knowledge and Gadia for Western knowledge. So there's plain English there that we're listening to stories from Gurindji elders and community members, also listening to stories from Gadia scientists, going on country to look at termite mounds, artists making artworks about these ideas and stories, Gurindji children also doing this, and that these ideas, stories and artworks are coming together in a book. So then the agreement, there's a number of different, this is just one of the agreements. This is for collaborative artwork where many artists have contributed to a single painting. There's a different art reproduction cost for solo artwork. And we also have a reproduction cost for the language experts. So that's been something that we've been working with lawyers on. The other example I wanted to give is something that happened, which is kind of interesting and I think speaks to following cultural protocols. So this was a talent release form, so essentially a photo image release form for the children's book that I showed you right at the beginning. One of the photos that we were using was of a little baby who had birthmarks on him, and the birthmarks are really significant in Gurindji culture. I've just given you one example of one of the photo release forms here. So the standard practice is for a child to have a parent or guardian sign off on a photograph and say that it's okay to use a photograph. But this was actually a really different situation where those birthmarks actually came through him, through a spirit. And what we ended up doing was actually getting permission from the particular family relation that this child had imbued the spirit from to reproduce the photo, because in a sense that child was a partial reincarnation of a previous person who passed away. So I've just got the example here of the release form from his mother, but we also then had a photo release form from the family who represented the person who passed away. So just sort of including this example to show you that these kinds of something as simple as a photo release form that doesn't even involve money and that sort of thing, or copyright or whatever, actually can be quite complex too. Okay, I'm going to be quiet again and hand back over to Miff, and hopefully William Santo to talk about supervision models.
Yeah, I'll just talk about it briefly. So what I just want to talk about, something quite different, really, a different context, different way of working that maybe certainly different for me, and maybe others have engaged in a similar sort of arrangement. I don't know. So when William Santo approached me to help work on a learner's guide, so Gudjul is the language of Central Queensland, and there's not a lot of documentation, and William's been documenting it, and he's put out quite a number of publications through vocabulary, so done a draft dictionary with linguist Cassie Williams and a number of theme-based publications with Cassie over the years through the local language centre. He now lives in Alice Springs and wanted to get something together on the grammar. So we recruited a master's student, and because this is in the COVID era, everything was going to be on Zoom. So basically the student was going to be working with William, going through a lot of the archival materials. And so William's knowledge of Gudjul comes from his own research and working with the archival materials. And at Sydney Uni, maybe other universities now, it's quite common to have supervisory panels. So you don't, even for a master's and an honours, you don't just have a single supervisor. It's a supervisory panel model. So we thought it would be a good idea to have William on the panel, as well as myself and Jackie Troy. So this panel of three meant that we could get William on as an affiliate, and essentially we shared the supervision hours in the department where I work. We're allocated a certain amount of hours, and that's all calculated into our work routine. So I shared those with William because students are only entitled to a set amount of hours, and that way he William's involvement is obviously crucial and essential to the project, and recognised as a co-supervisor as part of the supervisory panel. So the thesis has been handed in and assessed, and we're sort of getting more funding for that. So I don't know whether this sort of model is unique to music, because we have a lot of students that learn in music, obscure instruments, and they might have to have a teacher in China or somewhere. So it's quite common to have a supervisory panel of staff that are not at the university in the Faculty of Music where I am. So it wasn't sort of an unusual thing. Obviously it was unusual that it was linguistics, but that model was not unfamiliar. So that's all I wanted to say, and just acknowledge that we're sharing our resources, warts and all, and plenty of room for improvement, and look forward to any feedback or responses.